Thank you. We're not waiting on her. She's special with her loss of points. Yes, Chloe, she sacrificed points for you. This is Tuesday, November 25th, as we finish our story of the lottery with some special children. Be quick.
Okay. 1, 2, 3. Hi, Chloe!
Hopefully she's actually paying attention. All right, and back in. All right. From our story from yesterday, we start off with when's our story taking place?
June 27th.
Good job. Where is our story taking place?
In a village.
How big is the village? 300 people, which is not very big. And then we have the lottery taking place, and what does the lottery involve? What kind of device?
A box.
What's the black box on?
A stool.
Ooh, I added a stool today. And what's inside the black box? Paper. This is exciting. This is going to get. And they didn't always use paper. That's like a new device. What did they use before paper?
Rocks.
Chunks of wood. No, the rocks what the little kids were playing with because they're special. They didn't put rocks in the box. That's like a Dr. Seuss story. And so here we just had the fact they had chunks of wood inside the box. And then we have, let's see, that dude starting off. How long have they been doing the lottery?
Since forever.
Nice to know, for as long as we can remember. Then we're all the way over to the right-hand side, and that's pretty much all of that exposition was. A whole lot of stuff saying the lottery's been around forever. Kids play with rocks because they're special. With a box with paper on the inside of it. All right. Oh, and we had someone who just came running up right when we stopped. Who was the person that came running up?
Mrs.
Hutchinson.
Mrs. Velcro?
Hutchinson.
Delacroix. Oh, you said Velcro. Yes, Mrs. Hutchinson came running up at the last minute, and that's where we got to where it says Mrs. Hutchinson. And then we get a chance to go from there. Mrs. Hutchinson craned her neck to see through the crowd and found her husband and children standing near the front. She tapped Mrs. Delacroix on the arm as a farewell began to make her way through the crowd. The people separated good-humoredly to let her through. 2 or 3, as I said before, make sure you pay attention to tone, mood, as we go further into the story, what you're thinking that the characters are, how they're acting, excited, sad, grumpy.
Where are they?
On the right-hand side of that last paragraph.
Oh.
To let her through. 2 or 3 people said, in voices just loud enough to be heard across the crowd, "Here comes your Mrs. Hutchinson," and "Bill, she made it after all." Mrs. Hutchinson reached her husband, and Mr. Summers, who'd been waiting, said cheerfully, "Thought we were going to have to get on without you, Tessie." Mrs. Hutchinson said, grinning, "Wouldn't have me leave my dishes in the sink now, would you, Joe?" And soft laughter rang through the crowd as the people stirred back into position after Mrs. Hutchinson's arrival. "Well now," Mr. Summers said soberly, "guess we better get started, get this over with, so we can get back to work. Anybody ain't here? Dunbar?" Some people said, "Dunbar, Dunbar." Mr. Summers consulted his list. "Clyde Dunbar. That's right, he's broke his leg, hasn't he? Now, who's drawing for him?" "Me, I guess," a woman said, and Mr. Summers turned to look at her. "Wife draws for her husband," Mr. Summers said. "Now, don't you have a grown boy to do it for you, Janie?" Although Mr. Summers and everyone else in the village knew the answer perfectly well, it was the business of the official of the lottery to ask such questions formally. Mr. Summers waited with an expression of polite interest while Mrs. Dunbar answered. "Horace is not but 16 yet," Mrs. Dunbar said regretfully. "I guess I got to fill in for the old man this year." "Right," Mr. Summers said. He made a note on the list he was holding. Then he asked, "Watson boy drawing this year?" The tall boy in the crowd raised his hand. "Here, I'm drawing for my mother and me." He blinked his eyes nervously and ducked his head as several voices in the crowd said things like, "Good fellow, Jack, and glad to see your mother's got a man to do it." "Well," Mr. Summers said, "guess that's everyone. Did old man Warner make it?" "Here," a voice said, and Mr. Summers nodded. A sudden hush fell on the crowd as Mr. Summers cleared his throat and looked at the list. "All ready? Now, I'll read the names. Heads of families first. The men come up, take a paper out of the box. Keep the paper folded in your hand without looking at it till everyone has had a turn. Is everything clear?" The people had done it so many times, they only half listened to the directions. Most of them were quiet, wetting their lips, not looking around. Then Mr. Summers raised one hand high and said, "Adams!" A man disengaged himself from the crowd and came forward. "Hi, Steve," Mr. Summers said. Mr. Adams said, "Hi, Joe." They grinned at one another, humorlessly and nervously, Then Mr. Adams reached into the black box, took out a folded paper. He held it firmly by one corner as he turned and went hastily back to his place in the crowd, where he stood a little apart from his family, not looking down at his hand. All right, a couple things real quick. One, not everyone gets to draw for the lottery. Only certain people do. Have you figured out who gets to draw from the lottery? Marper?
All men.
Nicely done. We say whole men?
Only men.
Only men. And so part of it is, one, just men are getting to come up. Specifically, what men? Because it's not even all boys or not even all gentlemen, but certain men get to come up. Shorty?
The head of the family.
Yeah, so basically just fathers are getting to come up. If there's no father available, then who gets to come up?
The son is 16.
The oldest son, if he's like 16 or older. If you don't have an oldest son, then who comes up?
The mother.
Then the women get to come up. But basically it just goes off. And you'll find out in a moment it's not really sexist. Or it's a little sexist. But not really that as much as they're trying to figure out sort of who from each family. They're trying to figure out which family is going to win. So instead of having everyone come up, they're getting for a winning family. They just need one person from each family to come up. So that's sort of what they're aiming for right now when they come up there. Also, anything you've noticed about tone or mood yet so far? Abby Q?
Kind of quiet.
They do definitely seem quiet. I'll give you that one. Harper?
Well, you say winning, but like it's a thing. I guess I'm confused about I guess nobody really knows what the lottery's for yet, but.
Well, they know, but you mean here?
Yeah, I mean, they kind of seem like they're like not necessarily happy, but like a little anxious for it to be over with or something. I don't know.
See that? Anxious for it to be over? I can roll with that. Ike?
It seemed like they don't really care about it because they only listen to half the directions.
They definitely don't. Sort of like you guys in class. They're only kind of partway involved. They're like, words, old people talking. Yeah, I understand that one. Exclamation marks?
Nervous.
Nervous because of the excitement of winning?
No, they just all kind of seem like, kind of like jittery type nervous, kind of like anxiously nervous.
Back to that anxious thing. All right.
Yeah.
York?
Well, I think they seem nervous too, and I think the prize or the lottery or whatever is gonna be bad because, well, it's like your story, it's like listening that you picked out, and like the boy who was like, oh yeah, I'm picking for my family, they were all like, oh, he's a good man or whatever, and then the woman that had to pick for her
Dunbar?
husband or something,
Yeah.
she was like talking really like quietly and stuff.
All right. I can dig that. Snail?
I think that it's got like a vibe of like it's got the same like mood as the Reaping and the Hunger Games,
Oh.
because like they feel like they're all like, I don't even care about this, and then when somebody's chosen, they're all nervous and stuff. So
Killing
it
children
kind
is
of
fun.
reminds me of the Reaping at the Hunger Games.
Let's find out. We're going to find out our winning family here in just a moment. Allen! Mr. Summers said. Anderson! Bentham! Seems like there's no time at all between lotteries anymore, Mrs. Delacroix said to Mrs. Graves in the back row. Seems like we got through with the last one only last week. Time sure goes fast, Mrs. Graves said. Clark! Delacroix! There goes my old man, Mrs. Delacroix said. She held her breath while her husband went forward. Dunbar! Mr. Summers said. Mrs. Dunbar went steadily to the box while one of the women said, Go on, Janie! And another said, There she goes! We're next, Mrs. Graves said. She watched while Mr. Graves came around from the side of the box, greeted Mr. Summers gravely, and selected a slip of paper from the box. By now, I know, Graves, they're so witty. By now, all through the crowd, there were men holding the small folded papers in their large hands, turning them over and over nervously. Mrs. Dunbar and her two sons stood together, Mrs. Dunbar holding the slip of paper. Harbert! Hutchinson! Get up there, Bill, Mrs. Hutchinson said. The people near her laughed. Jones! They do say, Mr. Adams said to Old Man Warner, who stood next to him, that over in the North Village, well, they're talking of giving up the lottery. Old Man Warner snorted. Pack of crazy fools, he said. Listening to the young folks, nothing's good enough for them. Next thing you know, they'll be wanting to go back to living in caves and nobody work anymore and live that way for a while. Used to be a saying about lottery in June, corn be heavy soon. First thing you know, we'd all be eating stewed chickweed and acorns. There's always been a lottery, he added petulantly. It's bad enough to see young Joe Summers up there joking with everybody. Well, some places have already quit lotteries, Mrs. Adams said. Nothing but trouble in that, Old man Warner said stoutly. "Pack of young fools! Martin!" And Bobby Martin watched his father go forward. "Overdyke!" "Percy!" "I wish they'd hurry," Mrs. Dunbar said to her older son. "I wish they'd hurry." "They're almost through," her son said. "Well, you get ready to run tell Dad," Mrs. Dunbar said. Mr. Summers called his own name, then stepped forward precisely and selected a slip from the box. Then he called, "Warner!" "77th year I've been in the lottery," old man Warner said as he went through the crowd. "77th time." "Watson!" The tall boy came awkwardly through the crowd. Someone said, "Don't be nervous, Jack." And Mr. Summers said, "Take your time, son." "Zanini!" After that, there was a long pause, a breathless pause, until Mr. Summers, holding his slip of paper in the air, said, "All right, fellas." For a minute, no one moved. Then all the slips of paper were opened. Suddenly, all the women began to speak at once, saying, "Who is it? Who's got it? Is it the Dunbars? Is it the Watsons?" Then the voices began to say, "It's Hutchinson. It's Bill. Bill Hutchinson's got it." "Go tell your father," Mrs. Dunbar said to her older son. People began to look around to see the Hutchinsons. Bill Hutchinson was standing quiet, staring down at the paper in his hand. Suddenly, Tessie Hutchinson shouted to Mr. Summers, "You didn't give him time enough to take any paper he wanted. I saw you. It wasn't fair." And it goes to the second page, which I've not given you, so we'll get there in just a moment. But we find out we have a winning family. Who's our winning family? The Hutchinsons. And we've already heard the Hutchinsons once, because where were the Hutchinsons earlier, or why do we know them?
Because she was late.
Nice one. Tessie Hutchinson was late. How does Tessie respond to the news that her family's winners?
Something's bad.
They cheated.
That the guy, Mr. Summer, didn't do it.
So is she happy or not happy?
Happy.
Not
happy.
Oh, grumpy. Now, before, at the very beginning, what was her feeling about the whole, when she first showed up, was she against it then?
No.
She was kind of awkward.
Yeah. I'm just trying to find something I had in here, but apparently. There we go. I have the winning ticket. They haven't told you it's on the winning ticket yet. I tried to go through and find it. My apologies. A box of mini pigs. You go, box. So, the connotation in the story, the feeling we get, is it a good prize or a bad prize?
Bad.
Why do we say it's a bad prize?
Because she's not bad.
Maybe she's a sore loser.
She's
I
in
mean-
denial.
Maybe she's in denial. She's over in Africa. And so we'll find out here. Now we're going to find out lotteries. No, there's not even a good joke. We're going to find out that finding out the winning family was just step one. There's a second lottery we're getting ready to do. Because once we find out the winning family, now there's a second thing. So let's see if you can figure out what the next part of the lotteries would be here coming up. So all we do is find out that apparently Hutchinson family has won. So I'll read back up the last paragraph. Suddenly, Tessie Hutchinson shouted to Mr. Summers, "You didn't give him time to take any paper he wanted. I saw you. It wasn't fair." "Be a good sport, Tessie," Mrs. Delacroix called, and Mrs. Graves said, "All of us took the same chance." "Shut up, Tessie," Bill Hutchinson said. "Well, everyone," Mr. Summers said, "that was done pretty fast. Now we've got to be hurrying a little more to get done in time." He consulted his next list. "Bill, you drew for the Hutchinson family. You got any other households in the Hutchinsons?" "Well, there's Don and Eva," Mrs. Hutchinson yelled. "Make them take their chance." "Daughters draw with their husbands' new families, Tessie," Mr. Summers said gently. "You know that as well as anyone else." "It wasn't fair," Tessie said. "Well, I guess not, Joe," Bill Hutchinson said regretfully. "My daughter draws with her husband's family. That's only fair. I've got no other family except the kids. Then as far as for drawing as families is concerned, it's you," Mr. Summers said in explanation. "And as far as drawing for households is concerned, well, that's you too, right?" "Right," Bill Hutchinson said. "Well, how many kids, Bill?" Mr. Summers asked formally. 3. There's Bill Jr., Nancy, and little Davy. And then Tessie and me." All right then, Mr. Summers said. Harry, you got their tickets back? Mr. Graves nodded, held up the slips of paper. Put them in the box then, Mr. Summers directed. Take Bill's, put it in. Well, I think we ought to start over, Mrs. Hutchinson said as quietly as she could. I tell you it wasn't fair. You didn't give them time to choose. Everybody saw that. Mr. Graves had selected the 5 slips and put them in the box, and he dropped all the papers but those onto the ground where the breeze caught the extras and lifted them off and blew them away. Listen, everybody, Mrs. Hutchinson was saying to the people around her. Ready, Bill? Mr. Summers asked, and Bill Hutchinson, with one quick glance around at the wife and children, nodded. So what are they getting ready to do now?
See you in the
Murder?
See you in the
I mean, it could.
Yeah. Yorkie?
They're gonna like pick the person in the family.
Yeah. So the idea that you're going to pick which person in the family wins, because how many people are in the town? 300, that's a lot. So you're not going to have 300 people come up there and choose. You instead do it faster, you break them up into groups. And so you have each family come up. And then once you have a family, you just pick the one person in that family. And that's how you can sort of quickly figure out who's going to win. So we're going to get a winner for the lottery. It was just, we now found the family, and now we're going to pin it down to someone from that family. And are we excited to win yet?
No.
Remember, Mr. Summers said, take the slips and keep them folded until each person has taken one. Harry, you better help little Davy. Mr. Graves took the hand of the little boy, who came willingly with him up to the box. Take a paper out of the box, Davy, Mr. Summers said. And Davy put his hand in the box and laughed. No, take just one paper, Mr. Summers said. Harry, you hold it for him. Mr. Graves took the child's hand, removed the folded paper from the tight fist, and held it while little Dave stood next to him and looked up at him wonderingly. Nancy next, Mr. Summers said. Nancy was 12, and her school friends breathed heavily. She went forward, switching her skirt, and took the slip daintily from the box. Bill Jr., Mr. Summers said. Billy, his face red and his feet over large, nearly knocked the box over as he got a paper out. Tessie, Mr. Summers said. She hesitated for a minute, looking around defiantly, and then set her lips and went up to the box. She snatched a paper out, held it behind her. Bill, Mr. Summers said. Bill Hutchinson reached into the box and felt around, bringing his hand out at last with a slip of paper in it. The crowd was quiet. The girl whispered, I hope it's not Nancy. And the sound of the whisper reached the edges of the crowd. It's not the way it used to be, Old Man Warner said clearly. People ain't the way they used to be. All right, Mr. Summers said. Open the papers. Harry, you open little Davy's. Mr. Graves opened the slip of paper, and there was a general sigh through the crowd as he held it up, and everyone could see that it was blank. Nancy and Bill Jr. opened theirs at the same time, and both beamed and laughed, turning around to the crowd and holding their slips of paper above their heads. Tessie, Mr. Summers said. There was a pause. Then Mr. Summers looked at Bill Hutchinson. Bill unfolded his paper and showed it. It was blank. It's Tessie, Mr. Summers said, his voice now hushed. Show us her paper, Bill. Bill Hutchinson went over to his wife and forced the slip of paper out of her hand. It had the black spot on it. The black spot Mr. Summers had made the night before with a heavy pencil in the coal company office. Bill Hutchinson held it up, and there was a stir in the crowd. All right, folks, Mr. Summers said. Let's finish it quickly. Although the villagers had forgotten the ritual and lost the original black box, they still remembered to use stones. The pile of stones the boys had made earlier was ready. There were stones on the ground with the blowing scraps of paper that had come out of the box. Mrs. Delacroix selected a stone so large she had to pick it up with both hands and turned to Mrs. Dunbar. Come on, she said. Hurry up! Mrs. Dunbar had small stones in both hands, and she said, gasping for breath, I can't run at all. You'll have to go ahead. I'll catch up with you. The children had stones already, and someone gave little Davy Hutchinson a few pebbles. Tessie Hutchinson was in the center of a cleared space by now, and she held her hands out desperately as the villagers moved in on her. It isn't fair, she said. A stone hit her on the side of the head. Old Man Warner was saying, Come on, everyone! Steve Adams was in the front of the crowd of villagers with Mrs. Graves beside him. It isn't fair! It isn't right! Mrs. Hutchinson screamed. And then they were upon her. And it ends.
kind of loud in the back.
That says weird.
Really bad.
Maybe we should look at it.
spoil the story.
Mr. Brovicast said that this wasn't as weird of a story.
We're going to talk about it.
What kind of lottery is this?
I knew that
Oh,
was
yeah.
gonna happen.
Oh,
We
yeah.
should have a lottery in our class instead of using stones.
We do.
Use mark paper.
We have a lottery going here right now.
Horrible, though.
No, but I mean like with this type, like in the sphere of the story, and but instead of stones, we should use marshmallows.
Thank you.
So we find out what happens when you win.
You die.
Now, the idea of the story is that it works as a metaphor. The idea, it works on a number of different levels with this being a metaphor, of it connecting to one, conforming to other things. And it also works in the idea of joining in and attacking other people. The fact that Rose so quickly jumped into the idea of us participating in one of these, it goes back to the idea of Tessie. Was Tessie against the lottery?
Yes.
No.
Depends.
Oh.
What part of the story?
Yeah.
At the beginning of the story, was she against the lottery?
No.
No. Once she won, was she against the lottery?
Yes.
Heck yeah. Because all of a sudden, it's all fun and games as long as it's happening to someone else. But as soon as it happens to you, it's a whole different idea. The idea behind the story is the idea that mob mentality, that jumping in and that conforming, the idea that this can be connected to here at school. This is bullying. And the idea that you have, it can happen to anyone. Any random person can be bullied. Any random person can have everyone turn against them. Here in the story, it could be anyone. Did we know who was going to win the lottery? No. But as soon as that person wins, does everyone turn against them?
Yeah.
Does that same thing happen with junior high and bullying? All of a sudden you have that one person who was in the middle of everything, who was super popular and things are going for them, and all of a sudden out of nowhere they become this outcast pariah where things turn against them and they have no idea why and everyone hates them and makes fun of them and posts for it. They're like, but I have no idea. They're metaphorical stones, if you will. They're not actual rocks hitting them, but they're going to hurt just as much. That idea of people turning against each other, the idea that it's going to come out of nowhere, that's why I like this story. How repulsed and how outraged you guys get, and then you realize it's just writing about things that happen every day. It's just talking about the idea of people turning against each other. Another idea was when this was written, it was also connected to racism. And the idea that with this lottery, and the idea of traditions. I talked about yesterday that we were going to come back and talk about traditions with the story. People would ask, why do they do the lottery? Well, why does this town do the lottery?
Tradition.
It's been around forever because it was handed down to them. Do all the towns do the lottery?
No.
No. But it's the idea that they do it because it's what their family did and it got handed down. Well, think about racism. Racism is the idea of hating someone because of the color of their skin or something along those lines. Racism is not something that's naturally learned. You don't just pop out going, ooh, I hate people with different color skin, ah! It doesn't happen. Where does racism come from?
Parents.
Nicely done. Where do your parents get racism from?
Their parents.
So in a way of looking at it, racism is a form of
Mean. Tradition.
tradition and bullying. It's a form of that connection of both of them. Whereas the idea of you just attack someone, even though there's no basis behind it, even though there's no good reason for it, people buy into it. But the idea of racism and getting rid of racism, people violently are opposed to it. And they think that they fight for their right to be racist. Well, look at Old Man Warner. In Old Man Warner, when they talk about giving up the lottery, what are his thoughts on it?
No.
Yeah, he's like, what? He's like, only idiots would give that up. He's like, we've always had it. Because we've always had it, it's a good thing. You're like, no, just because you've always had it doesn't make it a good thing. So the idea of the story is to challenge things. If there are things that you think are wrong, you stand up to them. Even if they've been around forever. Even if it's this idea that everyone around you accepts because it's a tradition. If it's wrong, just because it's been around forever, doesn't make it okay. For the longest time, people of a different color couldn't vote. For the longest time, women couldn't vote. It was a tradition. It was how America was started. Did that make it right? No. So it's that idea that wanting you to challenge the idea of conformity, not doing what everyone else does. Now that doesn't mean coming up on Thursday when your family sits down to eat, you walk in and flip the table over and it's like, no, you can't make me! And then just go run outside and eat a hot dog. It's different. It's don't just rebel for the idea of rebelling, but the idea that when you feel that something is wrong, you stand up against it. And it's the idea of planting those little seeds of doubt into your head. And the idea of bullying. And just because everyone has attacked someone doesn't make it right. Yeah.
But I mean, and you say it's tradition, but I think at this point in time, I think most of us aren't really racist.
Agreed.
Away.
And that's the good thing, the fact that how life has changed. The fact that because at one time enough people rebelled against our racist lottery, if you will, that it's not becoming the strength and power it once was. And that's the idea of being able to overthrow that. Now we have other racist lotteries, if you will, or there's other lotteries about the idea of same-sex marriage, or things like that, where there's people who say, you can't do it because it's always been wrong. Challenge these ideas. Think about the real marriage settlement. Your only homework over break is
Read the story.
read the story I just gave you, read your book report book, eat some food, sleep a lot.